Hello and welcome to our Surviving Work conversation, and today we're going to be talking about more broadly about society and our social defences against anxiety. And to help us understand and think about this idea, we have David Armstrong and Michael Rustin. So my first question is just to tell us a little bit about your experience of work and what brought you into this field.
Well, I became a sociology lecturer in 1964, and for many years was mainly concerned with developing sociology courses in a new institution. But during the 1970s I became interested in psychoanalysis, and I suppose especially in the Kleinian theoretical paradigm in psychoanalysis, and found it immensely strong and interesting, and also found that some of the key ideas that were there were relevant socially and sociologically too. In fact, the first paper of any significance that I wrote was called A Socialist Consideration of Kleinian Psychoanalysis, can you imagine? Which appeared in New Left Review. So that was my interest in trying to bring those things together. I suppose in later years I've become increasingly interested in psychoanalysis and have become involved in teaching and developing programs, well, the academic accreditation programs here at the Tavistock.
Right.
And now I'm in a sort of post-retirement phase, only working part-time, and most of my work is done here at the Tavistock, either in relation to teaching research methods to child psychotherapists or in the broader field of applied psychoanalytic studies.
Well, I came into this field really completely by chance. It was a kind of lucky accident. I was reading a second degree at Cambridge in psychology. I was very interested in social psychology, which wasn't taught in the Cambridge degree at all. You had to sort of mug it up for yourself. And wondered what to do subsequently, and went to ask my professor his advice, and he said to me, there's only one place and one person it's worth considering if you're interested in social psychology, and that is Eric Trist in the Tavistock Institute. So I came up to the Tavi, saw Eric and one or two of the other people working there at the time. And Eric basically said, go back to Cambridge, get a good degree, and if so, join us. Which I did, never having had any particular knowledge or even interest in the Tavistock, and being very sceptical about psychoanalysis, because I trained in philosophy at Oxford, and in those days it was very sort of antagonistic world as far as psychoanalysis was concerned, by and large. And so I worked at the Tavistock for about 8 years doing action research on the impact of automation on working organisations and structures. Working in Manchester, in South Wales for 18 months on the setting up of a new iron and steel works, etc.
Exciting.
That's where I first began also working with groups, because I was in a group that was run by Wilfred Bion, who'd been enticed back by Ken Rice to the Tavistock at that time. And that had a very significant impact on me. And together with contacts with Isabel Menzies, as she was then, I gradually became interested in and then enthusiastic about psychoanalysis and the use of psychoanalytic ideas in thinking about organisational behaviour and organisational life. I then worked for a while for 10 years, in fact, in Chelsea College at the University of London on an action research project on student dropout and wastage. And then for 16 years in the Grubb Institute, which was a parallel body to the Tavistock in a way, on a project to do with youth unemployment, and then subsequently just working as a consultant and in training courses, one sort or another. And came back to the Tavistock, this time to the clinic, not the institute, in 94. I came back because I thought I wanted to be somewhere where the root in psychoanalysis was stronger than at the Grubb. And I think there were all sorts of other reasons why it was a kind of change that seemed to fit with where I was in terms of my thinking and my work. I have to say I've loved it, and I've never thought of leaving, even in the most difficult times. It's never occurred to me to leave. And although I'm now retired, all the work I do through Tavistock Consulting, which is the unit in the Tavistock there where I work. And basically I'm working entirely in sort of the organisational worlds of one sort or another, sometimes with individuals, sometimes with teams, sometimes with whole organisations, working from a Tavistock perspective, which is now sometimes called system psychodynamics, but it's really looking at what happens in organisations through a psychoanalytically influenced lens.
Now, both of you are, been highly active. I think of you as both writers and activists in your field. And you've written a great deal about the use of psychoanalytic ideas in organisations and societies more broadly. And you've just co-edited a new book, a great book called Social Defences Against Anxiety, Explorations in a Paradigm, which is a very helpful and practical, surprisingly practical, explanation about how psychoanalytic ideas can be used to help people within organisations and structures. I wonder if you could summarise together this paradigm of social defences against anxiety. What does it mean? What are we talking about?
Well, the starting point for me was that whenever one wanted to try to interest psychoanalytic students in the idea that these ideas might have some wider relevance than to individual cases, Isabel Menz's paper about the nursing systems, social defences against anxiety in the hospital situation, was always the key paper. And that was because the demonstration in that paper that what the hospital training system was supposed to do was so discrepant with what it was actually doing, was so powerful. And her argument that what was going on was a flight from the anxieties of the primary nursing tasks that these young girls were subjected to, with patients being ill and lots of bodily intimacy and so on, and that the bureaucratic, depersonalised, hierarchical, mindless structures that had evolved in the hospital were a way of not noticing, not taking account of the emotional suffering that the nurses were experiencing. That was always a kind of key paper in terms of saying, look, you can see what these ideas can do, and students always recognised, because they also knew of other situations which were, very dysfunctional in those kinds of terms. So the paper was always on the agenda, as it were, as one of the papers that weren't always introduced in trying to establish crossovers between a social and a psychological approach. Well, then, of course, other things happened. That paper was written in, 1969, 70? 69. A lot of things have happened since then, including social issues, social catastrophes, really, which drew attention to the fact that social defences against anxiety continued. In particular, all the various catastrophes in relation to the deaths of children in care. When people began to think about, well, why was it that even when everybody seemed to know that this child was at serious risk, nobody actually did anything? There was one particular case that was very influential in our thinking about it, was the Victoria Climbier case, when it was evident that doctors, policemen, social workers, everybody knew that this child was at serious risk and nobody acted. So the question then was, why didn't they act? And that led to a kind of updating, really, of the underlying theory, the underlying paradigm, because we came to think that not knowing, disavowal, turning a blind eye, in John Steiner's terms, was, as it were, a development of the kinds of anxieties that Isabel had talked about. She talked about paranoid, schizoid and depressive anxieties, essentially, as had Elliot Jakes, and we found ourselves looking at another form of anxiety. So then, in conversation with David and others, we came to think, well, look, why don't we look at this whole paradigm again? Why don't we see whether the development of psychoanalysis in the meantime, since 1969-70, and the development of society in the meantime, because lots of things have happened since the era when Isabel Menzies was writing, let's try and see whether this paradigm might be renewed and revived. And that's what got us into thinking about how to do that. And we wrote an initial outline, and we had a wonderful, very good seminar with 20 or 30 people. And out of that, very speedily, the contributors that you've been reading came together and produced this collection. So that's the origin of the project, as far as I'm concerned.
Maybe I could just add one or two things about the project and what lay behind it, because I think we were also interested in the extent to which the paradigm had tended to be taken for granted Everybody, as it were, referred to it. It was constantly used as a way of thinking about organisations, but it had not been really critically evaluated in any sort of strong way since it had been published. So it had a kind of status that, in a sense, was more to do with reputation than it to do with, as it were, sustained subsequent work. So that was one thing we wanted to do. Let's have a look at this again and see how far, given the changes both in psychoanalytic thinking and in what's happening in organisations, how far it can still continue to be sustained. So that was one area.
Yeah.
The other area was, it was produced in the late 60s. How far, given the organisational changes that have occurred since then, is it still robust enough to be able to, as it were, have a purchase on what's happening dynamically within organisations, and not just within the health service organisations, but also more generally. And one of the things we were interested in was, if you're looking at other organisations, what is the nature of the anxiety that may be aroused, and maybe defences emerge in relation to? And can one say something about differences in the nature of anxieties, the nature of defences that emerge within different kinds of organisational settings or contexts?
Okay, so...
Could I just add something?
Yes.
In relation to your observation, which I think is absolutely right, that the book is in a way quite practical, I think the other thing we became aware of was that in the course of people working with these issues, quite a lot of practices had evolved since Isabel started her work, in terms of how people could cope and manage these kinds of situations. In particular, I was interested in work discussion, because Margaret Rustin and her co-editor edited a collection on work discussion quite recently. And a number of the papers in the book actually talk about work discussion. That's to say, the shared reflection on a work situation with a view to understanding the underlying anxieties which, as it were, are problematic in it. We came to realise that quite a lot of work has been done, and could be done, was being done, in terms of trying to enable people to cope better with situations which gave rise to anxiety. So I think we wanted the book and the work to reflect the fact that we were not wanting simply to describe these situations, but also to show how responses could be developed that would be productive. And I think that's quite related to your interest in your surviving work.
Very much so. So I've got 3 questions. I don't know if this is... Well, I've got lots of thoughts about what you've just said. And in a way, I want to go to the punchline. Is it still relevant? Can we still use it? But instead, I'm going to just ask you to describe for us in very sort of practical terms. We've got different kinds of anxieties. So in the literature tradition, we've got a paranoid schizoid anxiety and a depressive anxiety. I'd like you just to describe in your own words what we mean by that.
Well, I mean, the origin of the concepts of the paranoid schizoid and the depressive lie in Melanie Klein's work.
Yeah.
And what she has in mind is that paranoid schizoid anxieties are primarily anxieties about retribution, punishment, blame coming from outside, and depressive anxieties are primarily about not what somebody might do to you, but the anxiety about what you might have done to them.
Wow.
It's about how far your own aggression, your own envy, hostility, etc., might have had damaging consequences. In the paper on nursing, I don't think she distinguishes these terribly clearly, actually. And of course, the two get transmuted into one another, because if people feel terrible depressive anxiety because of what they failed to do, they may also feel that somewhere at the end of the line it's going to come punishment and retribution for what they've done. Yeah. So she doesn't distinguish very closely between them. Elliot Jakes, in his paper on industrial relations, is rather clear about how one morphs into the other. So I think that's essentially the distinction. And of course, Klein's great contribution to psychoanalytic theory was her recognition that the anxiety that we're most disturbed by, which is most serious for us, is that which arises not from external aggression, but from our own aggression. That was in a way her great discovery, and that was her largest revision of what Freud had to say.
Okay, so then we've also got this concept of social defences, or defences, which are supposed to protect us from these overwhelming feelings of anxiety. And you mentioned the turning the blind eye and Steiner's work around psychic retreats. Yeah. So I wonder if you could just describe very common defences that people use in work to overcome these anxieties.
Well, let me just say something more about borderline states first, because the Steiner, Ron Britton argument is that as well as paranoid schizoid and depressive anxiety, there is another condition, which is where people find themselves, in a way, defending themselves against both paranoid schizoid and depressive anxiety by basically avoiding thought, by not noticing. They exist in a kind of somewhat de-affected kind of state of equilibrium, as it were, in which the way they manage is basically by not feeling and by not engaging, and that's what Steiner is talking about when he talks about narcissistic defences, borderline states. And if you like, the defence of turning a blind eye is the defence of simply not noticing, and that's what we felt went on when we were studying. Andrew Cooper, myself, Margaret Rustin were studying the responses to the Climbié case, because it's a very long and detailed report about everything that happened, in which what is apparent is that people did not notice what was absolutely right in front of their eyes. They seemed not to kind of respond to what was perfectly obvious. There were any number of points in that case where a nurse could have said to the doctor, "Look, doctor, I think we probably should go and see this child," but didn't say that, and so on. And that's the defence of turning a blind eye, of not knowing. That's the borderline state, which we then came to feel was a rather generic state. And Andrew Cooper and Julian Lusardo wrote a book called Borderline Welfare, in which they argue that that's become quite characteristic of a whole structure of feeling in a society where people simply choose not to notice what's happening in terms of social difficulties and sufferings.
And I think sort of in the sort of commentaries around what's happening for health and social care workers, that's actually a really profound way of understanding how these incredible omissions happen in everyday working life. But of course we also have much more sort of like violent defences, much more paranoid schizoid defences. So for example, the responses to people who've raised concerns, or whistleblowing as well. So there are other defences. I mean, the one about not knowing, not seeing, turning a blind eye, I think is very familiar to a lot of us. But there are also other defences.
Well, you could say that the response to whistleblowing, shooting the messenger, is about what happens when people find that their not knowing is challenged, when people say, "Look, this is happening." And one of the responses to that is to become very, very forceful in trying to repress unwelcome knowledge. And so the whole sphere of who does what with what kinds of information and knowledge becomes quite important. There is just one other dimension I would just like to introduce into the discussion, because it relates to what brings you into it all, which is that the starting point of the study of social defences against anxiety is primarily the anxieties produced by the primary task of the work. The teacher with the pupils, the nursery teacher with the young children, the toddlers, the nurses with the patients. And that was the primary concern that Isabel were addressing themselves to. There's now another kind of anxiety, which is that as the occupational systems themselves, as the welfare systems themselves become persecutory, people now feel not simply that there's a problem of how do I cope with the patients or how do I cope with the children, how do I cope with the authorities that are supposed to be managing what I'm doing. And that's one of the issues that is brought out in the book, where some of the contributions do talk about the anxiety brought about by these rather repressive and antagonistic systems of organisation, which is a different concern than motivated the original study, and wasn't actually what motivated my original interest. I wasn't primarily interested in the crisis of the welfare state and privatisation and managerialisation as the starting point to this, although as we got into it, it became clear that you couldn't avoid that as an important dimension.
Yeah.
I think there's just one thing I'd like to add, which is really much more organisational in a way. I mean, I think if you look at Isabel's original work, and certainly when she began to think about generalising it, one of the things that she emphasised was the way in which a kind of major, not whether it operates as a defence initially or whether it's just something that then subsequently serves the defence, was to do with fragmentation of the work or fragmentation of the task. So that in nurses, instead of it were the structure supporting the idea of a nurse as taking a kind of whole task view of individual patients in the ward, the whole thing was fragmented into different bits or pieces, as it were, which meant that it was very difficult to get a view of the totality of the situation emotionally, which was in contact with, as it were, individual patients. And then there were all sorts of ways in which responsibilities were split or divided up in a sort of somewhat arbitrary way. These were, I think, fundamental aspects of what Isabel saw as being some of the defensive ways in which, as it were, organisations managed the anxiety, or which evoked the anxiety that was implicit within the nature of the task itself. Now, of course, she also made the point that these defences don't work at the end of the day. They give rise to anxiety themselves. One sometimes forgets that she went into the original hospital study because of the extent to which student nurses were simply leaving before completing a course. There's a very high turnover. So in a sense, and she was very clear that one of the reasons why it was a high turnover was that the experience the nurses had on the ward as they were working was fundamentally counter to, as it were, the motivation they had for entering nursing in the first place, which was to do with, as it were, caring for ill and vulnerable people.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the real powers of psychoanalytic ideas in a non-moralising, non-judgmental way, by trying to understand why we have such powerful feelings over things like being an agency worker, for example, the loss of being in a team and having anybody talk to you on a daily basis, and why that affects us so deeply emotionally and psychologically, and also why it has such disastrous effects in terms of patient care. So I don't know whether you agree, but I think that sort of, in a way, psychoanalysis can't afford to waste this big crisis that's going on, certainly in health and social care.
You see, I think there is a kind of deeper way in which psychoanalytic ideas can help us to understand that, which go beyond the immediate crisis of all the pressures through marketisation, contraction, managerialisation, having to apply for your own job, all those kind of things that we know are going on. I think there has always been a feeling in the welfare services and the educational services that the pressures of markets and of legislation and all of that are in a certain kind of sense unwelcome. William Horton describes it as saying that these welfare services have, in a way, at their core, a kind of dependency culture. Not only the recognition of the proper dependency of pupils and patients on them, but also their sense that they depend on a benign society to support them in doing what they're doing. And since the society is not, and never has been, entirely benign in its treatment of these services, always rations the services, always makes demands of this kind and that, there have always been antagonisms and anxiety on the part of the staff of welfare services in relation to the wider society. It's a kind of underlying clash, you might think, between a kind of market ideology or framework which belongs to business and, to a degree, on the legislative framework which belongs to government, and the caring, compassionate, context, way of thinking that belongs in the welfare sector.
There's a danger of talking as if anxiety was to be understood negatively. Whereas anxiety, of course, is also the source of creativity and development. Without anxiety, there would be no push towards creativity and development. Yeah. And I think that's a sort of psychoanalytic concept that we need not to lose sight of.
Yes.
And it's important because one of the differences that emerged in the conference was the distinction between, on the one hand, the American and the European view, or the American and the British view, which was also linked to the distinction between private and public sector organisations, yes, or commercial organisations and service organisations, human service organisations. And the Americans were very much involved in saying, look, you can think of organisational circumstances or situations or kinds of organisations in which anxiety is at a premium. One needs people enter those organisations and in order to, as it were, face anxieties at a very high level. And in a sense, it's a source of considerable sort of creativity or achievement in terms of how they're working at it. The question is, what do they need in order to be able to sustain those levels of anxiety? And Larry Hirschhorn talks about what he called protective frames. Now, this is controversial stuff, but I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that it's not just, as it were, a single picture that emerges out of this kind of work.
No, and it's very rich what you've just said, because in my experience talking to health workers is there's a real desire, it's become very political, talking about things that didn't seem to be so political. And, you know, I'm on the left, so I'm delighted if anybody goes vaguely towards a critique of neoliberalism. But increasingly, we are seeing a political conflict, and that discussion, that political debate is really happening, whether consciously or not, in workplaces. And also my experience is that the crisis is such that it's actually quite energising. So in a way, these conversations can take place in a way that 10 years ago, I think it would have been very difficult to artificially bring them in. Now, and my experience from a trades union background is that when I was trying to talk about mental health and the politics of mental health, people would throw food because things were still working enough that we didn't have to address issues that were really difficult to address. Now it's just an open field. So there is a kind of energy of sort of how do you contain the anxiety, which is very difficult when you're on a 0-hour contract to even imagine opening up another debate. So I think there's sort of there's sort of like non-judgmental way that psychoanalysis looks at things like anxiety and defences. It's saying that defences are natural, and there's a point at which we have to protect ourselves, and a point at which, if we've got the capacity, that we have to collectivise and try and find some solutions. So I suppose that's one of the things that's really powerful for me about your book and your writings, is that it allows people who don't automatically identify themselves as raging Marxists to think a bit more critically about the political and social environment, which has a direct effect on their jobs. You know.
Just one other thing I would like to mention that we haven't mentioned so far, which emerges, I think, in the book, though not up front very often, and that's the extent to which one's moving into a contextual situation in which one of the anxieties that I think is around might be referred to as existential anxiety. That is anxiety about, as it were, the destruction or annihilation of something that's seen as central. I'm not thinking here just about one's personal identity, but essential, let's say, to one's professional or organisational identity.
Yeah.
So that one can no longer assume that the traditional ways in which people have found identity, either professionally or organisationally, that this is any longer sustainable in quite the same way. And even if you think about the health service, I mean, if you think about the work that's being, or the focus now on sort of integration across the health, social care spectrum, it raises really quite profound issues about how you see the identity of, as it were, the different professions that are involved at that interface. And it certainly in some of the work I've done with radically new mental health teams, which are trying to bridge social services, for example, and health, one of the challenges that people working in those teams have is how far they're able to sustain a view of, as it were, their work, and that in some ways goes against, as it were, the professional boundary or identity with which they've been trained and in which they're employed. So it's how one can sort of reconstruct a notion of what it means to be a nurse or a social worker within, or a psychotherapist within that sort of a team. And I think it's often experienced as extremely both difficult, sometimes painful, a source often of conflict within the team itself.
Yeah.
And I think that that's likely to become more and more dominant, I suspect, not just in the world of health and social care, but also more generally, as organisations lose something of the salience of the boundary around them that they've had for so long.
Yeah. But I think one of the experiences for people is, even if we've got a sense that we need to be able to engage with people, talk honestly, raise our concerns within our team, there are huge resistances to doing that. And one of the things that comes up in your book is about the importance of opening up discussions within groups. So I wonder what you have to say about this very difficult climate to actually do that.
I think one of the defences that operates nowadays might be referred to as managerialism. And I think it operates as a defence precisely against what? A defence against, as it were, the feeling of impossibility of really sorting out between people new ways of thinking about what it is that they're doing.
Yes.
I mean, and that's always been around. I mean, if you go back to the early days of the Tavistock, one of the things that, as it were, characterised those early days was, as it were, the belief that, as it were, the managerial philosophy operating within the National Coal Board itself at that time was getting in the way of the ability of working people, miners in this case, to, as it were, evolve ways of organising that, as it were, provided a more satisfying and also at the same time a more effective way of working than, as it were, the classic way in which industry was then sort of developing. So I do think we shouldn't lose sight of the extent to which I think one of the almost societal defences that operates is, as it were, the creation of structures which get in the way of enabling, as it were, people to work out something of their own ideas about, as it were, the best way of operating here and now within, as it were, the working circumstances that they face. So that, I think, I wouldn't want to lose sight of.
Well, I have some good news, people, because I think it's about to come back in fashion. So one of the interviews that we did last week was about this Dutch social care company, Buurtzorg, which has had a huge amount of press and publicity. Now, officially, it's done a tour of the UK as a new model for providing social care. Why? Officially, because it can provide better social care at 65% of the cost. How? By brutally cutting out the managerial level. What isn't said is that, in fact, it's a model of democratic leadership or flat leadership, where the teams set the targets for care.
Don't be too confident, however, that
Okay.
because somebody produces cast iron evidence that A works better than B, that people are going to say, oh, well, we must do A. The whole field of evidence-based policy is highly politicised.
No, I agree with you.
Well,
Highly
I mean,
politicized.
that is interesting that that's always been true, of course, because one of in the early days of the TAVI, I mean, it wasn't just that managers, incidentally, didn't believe that autonomous work groups could function effectively within the coal mine. Trade unions weren't terribly interested in it either, because all they were interested in was, as it were, conditions of work and wages.
That's right.
So the whole idea of trying to create a different sort of working culture was opposed collusively by both sides.
That's right.
But the Henderson Hospital commissioned research which demonstrated that their 1 year inpatient treatment for people with personality disorder was cost effective compared with not providing the treatment, because of the subsequent burden of the people who didn't have this kind of treatment made on, social security, doctors and so on and so forth. Within about 3 months after they produced their evidence, they were closed down. The evidence was of no account in the decisions that were made as to whether and a great institution died.
Yes, okay, so just to be clear, I mean, I worked in corporate social responsibility for a long time, so it is smoke and mirrors.
Yeah.
Just because you can present a financial case doesn't mean anything.
You have to do it.
As you say, it comes back down to the task, but also the values, the principles that underline why you're doing the work. All I'm saying is that the debate about democratic leadership, it's opened up again, and I think this is, and there is. I've been surprised at the amount of management consultants who are going, "What is it that explains this model?" Which has really captivated the interest. So I'm just saying there's a moment to re-debate it. But yes, it always comes down to essentially why you're doing it and what are the principles behind it. But I think we've been in many ways quite clever. Even trades unions finally got on the board of being able to use the language of the current debates to try and get something that they actually believe in place. And I think that in these discussions with health workers, we're feeling the absence of the opportunities that came with being a union member to sit in a room and talk to other people confidentially about things that mattered to them. So it's with huge sadness that I say that, but I think that's a part of this mix, which is, where are the opportunities to form solidaristic relationships with each other? Well, they're smaller and smaller, so there's a lot of pressure on your little supervision group to do so much stuff, including looking after the patient, but also looking after the clinicians.
I do feel that if you ask that question, what could improve personal relations within the workplace, I think one thing that might lead to some sort of improvement, if people were willing or ready or encouraged to actually talk about the relations that they have, to share that within some sort of context.
Yeah.
Because I think it's almost as if nowadays one tends to think of that whole side as a kind of byproduct rather than fundamental to the quality of what happens at work. How you get people to do that, of course, unless they're in a situation where things are going so awry that, as it were, they can be, as it were, mobilised into doing it, it's a difficult question. But at the times that I feel, of course, as a consultant, in a sense, one's been able to make a difference, is where one's been able to facilitate people really sharing their experience and feelings within the workplace and looking at what they're saying about the way in which things are functioning here and now.
Okay, my final question, which is what keeps you going doing this work?
Well, I was interested in you had two questions: what keeps you working and what's your tip up for surviving work? And I thought they were interesting questions to ask. I mean, what keeps me going, I would think, primarily is curiosity. It's feeling that this is a kind of world in which I still remain curious about how to understand X or Y, how to understand the patterning of relations. There's also the hope that one might be able to make a difference, that's true. But I think as I get older, it's the curiosity probably that keeps me going.
And the other thing is, the ideas themselves are endlessly interesting. And curiously enough, the older you get, the more connections you can see, because the range of things that one has done, do start to come together. So the combination of finding new things to think about and talk about in seminars and discussions, like this, and continuing to work with students. I mean, what could be more fun than that, really?
Just one other thing about, I said curiosity, the other thing is attachment. I mean, when I say attachment, I mean attachment to what I think of as it were, the Tavistock and the Tavistock tradition. I don't mean what happens necessarily now, but as it were, something that I think I owe all the best years of my working life to in some way, something that I feel I'm working within.
Yeah.
It's that mixture of sort of attachment and to a particular tradition or a particular place in some way, and curiosity, which I think is at the heart of how I see the Tavistock anyway. Well, a mixture of curiosity and activism, in a way. That's what keeps me going.
Gentlemen, thank you very, very much for this discussion.